Hello and welcome back to another episode of Blurble Reasoning. Today we're going to be talking about Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. A little bit different to other Blurble Reasonings. I want to take a step back and do some spoiler-free thoughts to begin with for people who just want to know my thoughts on a book that they've not read. And also we're going to go back to opening with the blurb, which is something I just kind of forgot I was doing in these videos. So without further ado, the blurb for Elantris. It reads, Elantris was built on magic and it thrived, but then the magic began to fade and Elantris began to rot. Now its shattered citizens face domination by a powerful Imperium. Can a young princess unite the people of Elantris and lead a rebellion against the Imperial Zealots? Brandon Sanderson's debut fantasy showed his skill as a storyteller and an imaginer of Baroque magical systems to be fully developed from the start. So yeah, just to give a quick overview of my Brandon Sanderson kind of bibliography of read titles. I've read through the first three Mistborn books, the original trilogy, back in 2017, I want to say, and I also read The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance around then as well. Ever since then, I've been meaning to return to Brandon Sanderson, and for whatever reason, it took me like 7 years to do so. I decided to go for the audiobook version of this book, which is narrated by Jack Garrett, and overall, I quite enjoyed this book. I don't read a lot of standalone books. I feel like almost everything is part of a larger series, and you could argue that this is part of a larger series because of the Cosmere. I've also since discovered that there are loose plans to write a second and third book to make this a trilogy as well. But for now, from where I'm sitting, this is a standalone fantasy novel in which its world was kind of written to just be, you know, in this book. It's not written to expand for like 13 more. I've just this year finished reading The Wheel of Time, so this is kind of the polar opposite of what I'm used to this year. I'm also reading through The Realm of the Elderlings right now, so that's also another very long book series. And so I wasn't quite sure how I would feel about this fantasy world, like just how big is it going to be? What is the point of establishing all of these different nations and all of these different political quirks if it's only going to last for one book, you know? Like, how far does it go? How well can you achieve this sense of realism and depth in regards to there being a wider world without spending too much time on it, because most of the book is set in one place? And to be fair, I think Brandon Sanderson strikes that balance perfectly. I think I've got a good idea from just incidental dialogue throughout many different chapters in the book of the different nations of the world and the state of geopolitics within that world. I have a pretty good idea of the different religions, of the different, you know, the history, the law, all that stuff. And yeah, I would be happy for this series to continue. I would pick up a sequel to this. At the same time, I don't feel like I'm left with too many unanswered questions. Of course, this is the spoiler-free segment. We'll get into that a bit more later. But yeah, I love the premise of this book, of this magical city where people are cursed, basically. It used to be like a blessing if you woke up as an Elantrian. This is all like premise stuff. But yeah, it used to be, you know, you'd wake up, you'd be like this god with like the silver skin and white hair, and you could do these magical powers and stuff. And then for whatever reason, 10 years ago, it became a curse, and it became a kind of living death where people could never truly die, and pain was everlasting. It's really interesting how Brandon explores what that means for the people of Elantris and the kind of society or lack thereof that is set up within those walls, and also how it affected the people outside of Elantris and the new kind of government they set up and the way that world works. I think we've got a pretty strong cast of characters. The main three characters we've got are Raoden, who shows us the inside of Elantris, we've got Serene, who shows us Kai, and we've got Hraithen, who is kind of our vehicle to learn about the religious side of this world and the kind of larger geopolitical state too. I don't want to spend too long on a spoiler-free segment because I do feel like I'm holding myself back from talking about this properly, so from here on out, I'm going to put up a big spoiler warning for the entirety of the book if you have not read it. It will now be spoiled for you. Get out of here, what are you doing? Take your chance to bail out of this video right now. Please give me a thumbs up on the way out, it would be really nice. So yeah, to go into more detail, what I liked, because I do have a section of nitpicks and it's quite a large section, so I want to start with the positives. I really liked the character of Raoden, just this optimistic guy who says no to fate and just deals with what he's been dished up, like realizes he's been taken by the Riode, is thrown into the city of Elantris, sees his fate as like having to exist in this mucky like city full of kind of, people have lost their minds and like depressed people and, 3 different gangs who are ruling the streets and that kind of stuff. And he was like, well, what I can do is I can make this place better before I go insane, so I'm going to do that. And of course, over the course of the book, he then discovers stuff about the Aeons and becomes interested in curing the people. And yeah, he's just a really strong character. I really like him. Like, just his voice throughout the story has been pretty fun to follow. I myself am someone who tries to be optimistic even in the worst of times. I find it like a very important part of me as a human being to make sure that I'm always working on the side of positivity, even when it's really hard to do so. So Raoden definitely appealed to me as a character. I also really liked Galadon. I think he is kind of one-dimensional. He's the darkness to Raoden's light, he's pessimistic. He's always going, but Suli, why are we doing this? But at the same time, I just really like the friendship that was struck up between them. I was kind of hoping for like this whole thing, because when Raoden first gets thrown into Elantris, he basically enlists Galadon's services for a month. And I was really hoping that by the end of the book, Raoden would be like, oh, hang on a minute, it's been past a month, and then Galadon would have to confront his feelings of friendship to Raoden. Unfortunately, that isn't the thing that happened. Brandon, hi. Just me, hi, how's it going? I would throw something like that in there. There are plenty of other scenes which, kind of do the same thing, but I thought it would have been cute. I was waiting for it. Anyway, as I've already mentioned, I really like the Riode. I feel like it's a fairly unique thing. I did see in the reviews someone mentioned that it reminded them of Suramar in World of Warcraft, with the Nightborn elves and their reliance on magic and the scarcity of the Arc wine. But Suramar came after Elantris, so for all we know, someone on the World of Warcraft narrative team read Elantris and went, oh, that's good, I'll use that. But yeah, the idea of, if you stub your toe, you will feel the pain of your stubbed toe for the rest of your days is horrifying, and it's a really good kind of offset to the relentless optimism of Raoden having to deal with this chronic pain. And, I'm not someone, thankfully, who has to deal with chronic pain in his life. And I do wonder, like, other perspectives of people who do deal with chronic pain throughout their life. What do they think of this book? How well was it represented? Because it's fun to be like, oh yeah, this is a magical curse, but at the same time, it is something that does happen in the real world. I did like the character of Serene as well. I thought she was a very strong character, and I like how, similarly to Raoden, she kind of arrives and then makes the best of a bad situation. She isn't defined by her failed relationships and her feeling of wanting someone to complete her or anything like that, but at the same time it is a part of her character, a realistic part of her character, that she hasn't found love, and I think that's realistic. I also think it could have been applied to Raoden or male characters in the book. Perhaps it doesn't always have to be, the women who are looking for love all the time, but I thought it was handled pretty well. I guess we do have Hrafen realizing he's jealous of Raoden towards the end of the book, so there is a little bit of that. Of course, it's a Brandon Sanderson book, so I really like the magic system, the kind of aeonic runes that you draw, and you have to draw them very precisely, and you can combine different runes, almost like a coding language of like, if this, then this. You can kind of do that with runes and cause different effects. I think that's really fucking cool. There was also a very fun build-up of learning how this magic system even worked, and then the revelation that it's also tied to the lands, and the reason, huge spoiler again, if you haven't read this book, get out now, the whole reason for the Riode is because, it was never explicitly stated, but I'm pretty sure it's because there was an earthquake which caused a giant ravine to open up, and because of that, all of the Aeons became invalid. And it was only when Raoden realized he needed to start incorporating the chasm line into his sigils, glyphs, whatever you want to call them, Aeons, I guess, that they actually started working again, and he was able to kill the people. Finally, I liked the nations of this world. I already mentioned this in the spoiler-free part, but yeah, I felt like they all had pretty distinctive personalities. I had a pretty good sense of, Fjordell is clearly like quite a Nordic land, and that kind of stuff. There were also implications that this was just one continent on this wider world, and there was more to be discovered elsewhere, but we didn't get to it. That could be a cool thing to explore in a sequel, because the world is called Cell, right? So I'm trying to keep on top of like the Cosmere stuff, because the first time I read The Mistborn, I didn't really consider any of that, and apparently there's some ties to it in like the Stormlight archive and stuff. And yeah, that would be that would be cool if I had realized that. So I'm keeping an eye on this stuff now. Okay, now get ready for my nitpicks because I have a few of them. The writing style. So this is Brandon's earliest published book and one of his earliest written works that we've ever seen. And I do think that comes across in his writing style. For one thing, I've been trying to put my finger on it like the entire book. But one thing I found is that the writing style is too jovial. Like, I know it's kind of a staple of Brandon's works that characters kind of like rib each other and have a joke and you know, every now and again. He's not exactly a grim, dark writer, and he doesn't need to be. But I found in this book specifically there was far too much jovial dialogue in places where it didn't really fit, and it really started to grate on me after a while. A specific example I can point out is when Serene discovers that King Iadon is doing blood sacrifice. And of course, in the moment, she's horrified, it's terrifying, she screams, and there is some talk afterwards about how she will always remember that image for the rest of her life. Good. But in the course of uncovering the king's ties to what I guess it's called the mysteries, to this cult, basically, she ends up kind of, you know, discrediting him, overthrowing him, and people, they all just kind of joke about it immediately afterwards. Geez, Serene, first you plot against the king, then you save his throne, and then you overthrow him by uncovering him as a cult member. You silly girl, this is all a bit wacky, isn't it? And I get the whole, like, you have to laugh attitude to things continually going wrong or weird, but it didn't come across that way. It was just like, okay, dude, you should probably be a little bit more worried. I didn't believe that a lot of these characters were really worried for their nation, if you know what I mean. It felt kind of weirdly inauthentic. Speaking of dark things within the narrative not really being given a time of day, at one point it's discovered that Sheo, one of the gang leaders in Elantris, is a little girl who is being worshipped as a god and is demanding food from her followers. And when Raoden manages to tempt those followers away by teaching them how to cook, they end up killing Sheo, and really, like, hardly any words are dedicated to that. This is a child who has gone mad with starvation in a cursed city, begging for food, or demanding food, who has been killed by her followers. That's a pretty dark thing, and we barely linger on it. Like, if I was Raoden, I would at least feel some sense of guilt and horror. There's a surprising amount of child suffering and mortality in this book, which isn't really lingered on. It's very strange. I get not wanting to linger on it because it's an uncomfortable topic, but in that case, maybe don't put that topic in your book to begin with, because otherwise it comes off weird. Also, in terms of, like, the tone being too jovial or whatever, I do also want to say it could be a consequence of the narration. Jack Garrett did a great job, don't get me wrong, and I especially liked his voice for Hrafen. I will always think of him as Hrafen's voice. You know how, like, you tend to have, like, a narrator, you kind of picture them as, like, this one specific character in the book, even though they voice all of them. But something about Jack Garrett's narration was quite upbeat and jovial, like, oh, princess, you've overthrown the king. I can't help but wonder if Michael Kramer were to voice this, would I be having these issues? Again, I don't know. I'm not outright, like, damning Jack Garrett's performance. It was good, but I'm wondering if this was a consequence of that. Next nitpick, religious themes, and I apologize because, for context, I am like an agnostic leading atheist. I don't think I'm the smartest atheist in the room. I don't think that religions should be looked down on or anything like that. But some of the religious themes in this book did get on my nerves just a little bit. And I have a hard time putting my finger on exactly why, but a lot of Hrafen's chapters really bugged me. And to be fair, the man was going through a crisis of faith, and now that I've read the complete book, I feel a little bit less annoyed about some of his chapters, because I think a lot of what I was thinking at him are things that he eventually realized towards the end of his character arc. But a lot of how he went about preaching about his religion to the people was so coldly logical. And he was, like, thinking about, oh, our doctrine says this, these people must be converted. There was just, like, no personal faith within his words, no conviction. And knowing that this was written by a religious man, I was kind of, like, being like, what are we doing here? I found it odd, I think, that Brandon Sanderson could write so well about a man preaching his faith without conviction when Brandon Sanderson is a man of faith himself, but that's getting a little personal, and a little bit non-critical, so I won't go too much further into that. But it just kind of felt like the whole Shukorov stuff felt like it was coming from a place of experience, and I couldn't quite put together how that could be written in such a way whilst also still being part of the religion that he's part of. I don't know. Anyway, I apologize if that was too personal. I don't mean it to be. It's just something that kept nagging at me while I was reading this book. As someone who is not a man of faith, a lot of my lack of understanding probably comes from not having a faith. So next up, some stuff felt a little disconnected. So for instance, while we do spend a little bit of time with Raiden coming to grips with his father's death when he learns about Eidolon hanging himself, we never hear him talk about his mother. Now, I could have missed something. Maybe Eidolon's wife is not Raoden's mother, but she does die towards the final parts of a book, unless I mistook her for someone else. But I'm pretty sure she dies during the invasion of Arelon. And absolutely nothing is mentioned of Raoden's relationship to his mother. Nothing is mentioned of his feelings towards her death, towards the end of a book. There is absolutely no text dedicated to linking the king's wife to Raoden's mother. It's weird. Like, it's to the point where I'm pretty sure I must have missed something. The king's wife must be his stepmother or something. But even then, surely he would have some kind of relationship with her. So there's one thing that I thought was a little bit weirdly missing. Another familial connection that's a little bit overlooked. When we first meet Karata, who's one of the gang leaders in Elantris, we learn that she's very worried for her child because she's the mother of a child, and when the Rio took her, she didn't have a chance to say goodbye or let her child know what had happened to her. This is a nice little character moment, but it's never brought up again. And when Arelon is being invaded and innocent people are being put to the sword, Karata doesn't go looking for her children. She doesn't seem to think about them at all. She's just with Galadon looking after Raoden. To me, that feels like a massive oversight for her character. It straight up does not make sense to me that she would just not think about this. So yeah, for me in this book, it feels like familial connections are just not that important or well thought of. And then while we're talking about things that felt disconnected, the final thing is that they keep talking about how Elantris fell 10 years ago, but there's so little time dedicated to talking about what society was like before Elantris fell, that it felt like it fell 50 years ago or more. This might be a subjective thing, maybe other people don't feel the same, but when I see the city of Kai and the society of Arelon, I really don't see a society that's only 10 years new. And again, not wanting to make everything feel new, because then it would feel like less than 10 years. And he does mention that, you know, people don't really talk about Elantris, it's kind of a taboo topic, so that's probably why. But the effect that ended up giving was just that the whole Elantris thing must have happened more than 10 years ago, because like no one talks about Elantrians that they remembered, like specific individuals who fell to the Riod or anything like that. It just makes it seem like this intangible event that happened many years in the past. I would not be surprised to learn that it initially happened further ago than 10 years and was changed in a later draft of the book. Okay. Those are all my nitpicks. I apologize if it feels like I've ripped this book apart, but for me, Brandon Sanderson is such a good writer that it's been a little surprising reading Elantris and being like, oh, this is actually not as good as his normal stuff. Obviously, I knew going into it that that would be the case, so maybe it's also because I was looking for it. But like, such a well-respected author, and I know people love this book in particular as well, don't get me wrong. But it was interesting to me to go like, oh, I can kind of see where he improved from this book. But I just want to reiterate, I did enjoy this book. It's not a 5 out of 5 for me. I rated it 4 out of 5 on my spreadsheet. But it's a good book, but it's not the best. Still better than anything I could write, probably. We're not done with the notes though. Hoid is in this book, and I've heard about Hoid. He shows up in these books. Hoid shows up within the text towards the end as kind of like this, I forget, like this merchant or this beggar or something. And he's a very insubstantial character. If you're not looking for him, you'd probably miss him, which is probably why I don't remember him in Mistborn. Because apparently he's in that too, or at least I assume he is. Hoid is a character, if you don't know, who apparently pops up in lots of Cosmere worlds. And I'm wondering if he was an addition to the 10-year anniversary version of the book. There is a kind of quote-unquote post-credits chapter with him in, which I am almost certain is an addition to the 10-year anniversary of the book. But yeah, I've picked up on this fella being a Cosmere plant. It's interesting how he's trying to transform himself into an Elantrian and failing, and also that he's befriended a Sion who's kind of hovering there like, it doesn't work like that. This particular Sion seems very bitter about its subservience to humanity. It says that all the races in the world laugh at them, which I do think is a good addition if it is indeed an addition to the 10-year anniversary of the book, because I think there are inherent issues in having a subservient race that is just happy to be subservient, and it's just its inherent nature to be subservient. It would be lost without being a slave race. They're not presented as a slave race, but you know what I mean. We also have a chapter which contains notes on the Aeonic magic system, and I noted some of the language here talking about it, like from the perspective of someone who's visited multiple different Cosmere worlds and witnessed different types of magic within the Cosmere, and whoever's writing about Aeonic magic here talks about how different it is to other types of magic, and like how it's developed as magic from a shard of Adolnasium or something like that. I don't know how to pronounce the name. That seems very important, especially since the frickin' Stormlight Archive has shard blades. So, as someone who knows very, very little about Cosmere lore, my best guess is that the Cosmere universe is a universe in which I don't know, a god or the corpse of a god splintered into several shards and fell to these different worlds, and magic systems kind of like came out of the corpses of that one true god or something. That is my pie in the sky theory, and that's who Adolnasium is or whatever. Please don't tell me if I'm right. I would like to find this out for myself. I'm sure we still don't know, even for people who've read all the books, although I'm sure you have a much better idea than I do. But I will say, like, all the Cosmere stuff at the end of this book to kind of, like, you know, put its tendrils out there to relate it to other future works in the Cosmere, that stuff I found more compelling than the book itself, almost. It does feel like it was written later. I don't know which parts were and which parts weren't. I would be shocked if the very final chapter with Hoyd in it existed in the original text, especially since it comes after like a bunch of behind the scenes stuff with deleted scenes and stuff like that, which was pretty fun. Like learning that originally there was an evil twin to Raoden, and how he just didn't quite fit into the story and so was cut out of the story. Like, it's really interesting as a writer myself to like see that constructive editing process. But yeah, in a sequel, there's lots to explore. Wyrn's empire remains a threat. We still don't know what the Scions are. I would like it if we explored some themes about trying not to deify the Elantrians again, because a lot of the problems within Arelon came from deifying the Elantrians and then not knowing what to do when they fell. There are some hints of that towards the end of the book, of being like, oh, they love Raoden not because of his Elantrian skin, but because of who he was before he became an Elantrian. But I feel like we could still get an entire book out of being like, hey, don't worship me. And yeah, it'd be cool to see how Arelonian society changed with, the Elantrians rising again and Aeonic magic being a part of it again, because again, that's part of my problem with the whole Elantris fell 10 years ago thing, is nobody seems to know what Aeonic magic is or how it works. I'm just like, yeah, but it was 10 years ago, not freaking 1,000 years ago. But yeah, that sums up my thoughts on Elantris. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed. Once again, just to reiterate, I did enjoy the book. I worried that this review was just full of nitpicks, but I feel like this book was almost defined by its rough edges, if you will, by being Brandon's first published work, and I kind of wanted to explore that side of it. The next audiobook I'll read, because this was part of my kind of, if we have a three lanes of what I'm reading, this was my audiobook lane. The next audiobook I'm reading is The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien, because Elantris was kind of a break between Fellowship and The Two Towers. I might then read Warbreaker in between The Two Towers and Return of the King, just because I like breaking up these trilogies, because it gives me a better idea of the events of each individual book. So that's something I'm currently experimenting with. Next book I outright finish is likely to be Ship of Destiny by Robin Hobb, so meet you back here later for that, probably. Thanks for coming by.